It was a crisp October evening when Emily West, a 20-year-old practicing Christian, arrived in Takam, a small, remote town in northern Iran. Having come from a bustling city in the west, she was both eager and apprehensive about her mission. Emily was a volunteer for a humanitarian organization, tasked with setting up a small clinic to provide medical assistance to the locals. The town was nestled among misty hills, shrouded in an eerie silence that was occasionally broken by the whispering wind. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a darkness that seemed almost tangible. Emily had heard whispers about Takam's strange reputation, but dismissed them as mere superstitions. Her focus was on the task ahead, her faith guiding her. Her arrival did not go unnoticed. The locals, though welcoming, eyed her with a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. The mayor, a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes, greeted her warmly but made an odd request. Please, avoid wandering too far after dark. Takam has its peculiarities. Emily smiled politely, brushing off his comment. As night fell, she settled into a modest guest house on the outskirts of town. The building was old but clean, with a few basic amenities. She tried to ignore the odd creaks and groans of the house as she prepared for the work ahead. The legend of Takam was one Emily had read about in passing. It was said that decades ago, a woman named Zaynab had lived in the area. Zaynab was a healer, revered and feared by the townspeople. Rumor had it that she had practiced ancient rites, blending pre-Islamic traditions with her own dark magic. After a series of unexplained disappearances, Zaynab vanished, leaving behind only tales of her malevolent spirit. The story took a darker turn with the legend of the Takam curse. It was said that anyone who ventured too far into the hills after sunset would encounter Zaynab's restless spirit. The spirit was said to be both beautiful and terrifying, with a face that shifted between an alluring mask and a grotesque horror. Those who saw her were doomed to suffer a fate worse than death, being trapped between worlds, unable to move on. Emily was skeptical of such stories, but couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. The locals avoided talking about the curse in detail, adding to her growing discomfort. 2 weeks into her stay, Emily's work was going well, but she found herself increasingly fascinated by Takam's folklore. One evening, driven by a mix of curiosity and skepticism, she decided to venture into the hills despite the mayor's warning. She walked along a narrow, winding path that seemed to lead into a dense forest. The darkness enveloped her, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. Her flashlight cast eerie shadows, and the stillness of the night was unsettling. As she continued, she noticed an old, abandoned house partially hidden by the overgrowth. The structure seemed ancient, its wooden beams rotting and windows shattered. Emily's curiosity got the better of her, and she approached the house. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over her. Inside, the house was even more unsettling. Dust-covered furniture and broken trinkets were strewn about. On one wall, Emily noticed strange symbols painted in what looked like old blood. As she examined them, she heard a faint whisper, almost imperceptible. It seemed to beckon her deeper into the house. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the building, making Emily jump. She spun around, her heart pounding. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw a shadow dart across the room. Her rational mind told her it was probably an animal, but the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. She decided to leave, but found that the path she had taken seemed different. The forest was denser, the shadows darker. Panic set in as she realized she was lost. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, guiding her deeper into the woods. Hours passed, and Emily's sense of time became distorted. She stumbled upon a small clearing with a stone altar in the center. The altar was covered in strange symbols, similar to those in the abandoned house. The air was thick with an oppressive energy. Suddenly, she saw her. A figure emerged from the shadows. An ethereal woman with a hauntingly beautiful face. Her eyes were hollow, and her expression was a mix of sorrow and malice. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She knew, instinctively, that this was the spirit of Zaynab. Zaynab's voice was a chilling whisper. "Why do you intrude upon my domain?" Her words carried a weight that made Emily's legs tremble. Emily tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Leave this place," Zaynab continued, her form shifting between a spectral beauty and a ghastly visage. "Leave before it's too late." Emily turned to run, but the path seemed to shift and twist, leading her in circles. Her flashlight flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of tormented voices. In her desperation, Emily ran blindly through the forest, branches scratching at her skin. She stumbled, falling to the ground. When she looked up, Zaynab stood over her face now a grotesque mask of anger and despair. The spirit reached out with a cold, skeletal hand, and Emily felt an icy grip on her arm. Her vision blurred, and she was overcome by a wave of despair. She could hear the whispers more clearly now, pleading and mournful. Suddenly, the grip vanished, and Emily collapsed on the forest floor. The whispers faded, and the forest fell silent. Emily was left alone, disoriented and terrified. The sun was rising when Emily finally found her way back to the guest house. Her clothes were torn, and she was covered in scratches. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She tried to convince herself it was just a bad dream, but the terror in her eyes told a different story. The locals noticed her distress immediately. The mayor, upon seeing her condition, hurried over. "You've seen her, haven't you?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of pity and dread. Emily nodded, too exhausted to speak. The mayor led her inside and offered her a warm drink. "You're lucky to have escaped. The curse of Takam is very real. Zaynab's spirit is bound to these hills, and she does not take kindly to intruders." Emily could only nod, her mind still reeling from the encounter. She left Takam the next morning, her faith shaken and her soul scarred. She never spoke of her experience to anyone, but the nightmares followed her for years, a constant reminder of the chilling legend she had dared to confront. Years later, rumors began to spread about a new volunteer who had vanished in Takam under similar circumstances. Some say she too had ventured into the forest, driven by curiosity or a sense of duty. But just like Emily, she was never seen again. The legend of Takam lived on, a chilling tale passed down through the generations. The locals continued to whisper about the curse, cautioning anyone who would listen. And those who dared to challenge the darkness were left with the haunting question: what happens to those who fall victim to the restless spirit of Zaynab? In the end, Takam remained a place of mystery and fear, a dark reminder that some legends are rooted in truths too terrifying to ignore.